Hello, this is Dr. Jyothi Robertson. Welcome to The Journey You Own. In this interview, I am speaking with Gabrielle Chapman. I begin this part of my conversation with Gabby by asking her a little bit about her past and some of her motivations in childhood.
When and where did you start your racial justice work? Mark that time.
Yeah, so it was funny. I ended up dropping out of UK. I started to move more into the horse world. I was training horses professionally. I moved to Texas, and that was the year that the young man in Florida, and for whatever reason his name was escaping me, he was killed with like a bag of Skittles. And the reason his name is escaping me is because during that time, I was so like into the horse world that I had like shut all these other things out. So on social media, I remember like seeing the different stuff, but I was like completely disengaged. And then I ended up moving home, and I think I was like 20. And I was still doing the horse stuff. And I had gotten back into college, and I remember reading about the Syrian conflict and Syrian refugees. And my mother was a political science major, so she went to college, and like she was a single mom, like putting herself through college. And you know, these are things that she would have talked about maybe, but I just really remember feeling really uncomfortable about the United States' position or inaction of like intervening in that humanitarian crisis. And then the Michael Brown incident happened, and that also was, you know, that's really when things sort of for me kicked into high gear. I think that it was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back. I'd already sort of been reading about different stuff and kind of becoming more aware. But there was this movement across like young people and college students at that time that I really wanted to be a part of. And I ended up like hosting like a little rally for Michael Brown in West Virginia. And it was like 10 people on the Capitol steps, like nothing really, very few people showed up. And within a few years, like, I don't know, it was this whirlwind of folks that were like me getting engaged. I ended up reading The New Jim Crow in a class, and like actually that was an interesting time too, because I remember being the only person of color in this class, and everyone was very reluctant. They didn't want to read that book. They were like, no. They didn't believe it. They didn't believe what that author had written and like how disturbing our justice system was. And I ended up giving a presentation at the end of that course, and it was about how the media played a large role in like shaping narratives around stereotypes of Black and brown people. And I remember by the end of this presentation, like every person's face was like beet red. Like no one wanted to know, like hear the truth. And it really wasn't that, I mean, I went back into like, I talked about caricatures and Jim Crow and like, even like how today's media, like the Housewives of Atlanta, like how there's sort of this way that we, even within our own Black culture and narratives, how we like create sort of hierarchy of like light skin versus dark skin, and like how there's like internalized racism within our own group of people that like tries to aspire to whiteness. So like, not that this is the truth for everyone, but I think that there is this like idea that if we have straight hair or if we're, you know, fairer skinned, you know, we're getting closer to whiteness. and like in some ways that's more approved. And in fact, some people believe like you're more successful if you have these types of features, and that's something that the media perpetuates sometimes. And I learned after giving that presentation by traveling, like what I had hypothesized at that time, you know, it was actually deeper than just in our own culture. Like I went to like Japan and like China and different places where, you know, they do the same stuff. Like they're bleaching their skin, and, you know, there's this sort of sickness and obsession with whiteness or being more white. And I actually was like completely in a place at that point. I wanted to reject all of that to a degree, but you know, it was for me at that time. There was just so many like things that were coming up in my mind and in my journey in that time. And then just traveling overseas, like I said, it also sort of blew it up to another level, also in a good way. But I think within the journey, I also kind of like had to deal with my own like imposter syndrome and like, you know, what does that mean for me in comparison? You know, what is my duty as a human? Like what role do I have to play in this, like figuring out how to peel back the onion of like our colonial kind of like mind frame. Yeah.
The colonial mind frame is really interesting, especially when you talk about Asia, because I've thought about that a lot recently. Just having spent a lot of time in different parts of Asia and being Indian, you know, I was speaking with another woman in animal welfare, and she was talking to me about a particular cream that's sold in India called Fair and Lovely. Mm-hmm. And the idea is, you know, I mean, of course, India was also a colony. You know, only in 1947 did it achieve independence.
Right.
And so there's this cream that all the women put to bleach their skin, and it literally bleaches, I guess, their skin. Mm-hmm. And I remember growing up, and I'm much darker than my mother. And my grandmother would say, oh, she's pretty, but and in Telugu she would say, you know, Papa Nalagondi. So that means, poor thing, she's so black.
Yeah.
And that idea of color, like I'm using black as the color of the skin versus brown versus white, has perpetuated itself across nations, continents. I mean, it's fascinating to think about, because at least for me, just, you know, from this idea of this British colony, this tiny little country that how, you know, like how the majority of the world is, you know, was not white at the time, right? And
that actually was the concept that I had to kind of reconcile with, because I remember meeting this poet. He was from Brown, and I was just like fascinated by his work. He was like, you know, like black people are not a minority. Like globally, we're actually the majority, but they tell you, and it's like a psychological kind of like idea to like make yourself believe. Even the word minority, it kind of has this connotation of like less than, or you're in the subgroup, you know. So it's just a very fascinating concept, you know.
Yeah, and you trace it back to its roots. You know, you think about these civilizations that were beginning. You had, you know, the Euphrates River, and then you have the Indus River Valley civilization, and then you had, you know, like these various pockets, and that population of whiteness was the smallest of the civilizations at the time as well. Right. And yet we're still living that same history.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's weird because now, I was actually just thinking about this, and I'm still not even able to quite articulate it, so this will be the first time. You know, so there's a level of frustration. Like, I've met lots of activists who are like, separatists that like believe in like Black liberation in such a radical way that they want to like have their own sovereign like country, you know, this whole Black nationalist idea. And I can totally see or understand that perspective. And then but it's sort of similar to sort of these white nationalist perspectives of like, you know, white purity and stuff. And I'm sort of working through this idea of, and it's sort of like a Buddhist sort of idea of like, of fluidity, and like there not being sort of a binary of, you know, it doesn't have to be one way or the other. And it's not just race, it's like everything in life. And I struggle, and in my own journey, there has been sort of a, you know, since we have decided that we're going to elevate, you know, whiteness as our norm, I have like figured out ways to like try to elevate Blackness. Okay, like, you know, whatever that might look like. Or to like find the joy and the beauty in like in the other. And I think that there are some like spiritual practices and folks that I follow who talk about how our society has been so dominated by masculine energy, and like the masculine is the rigid and like, you know, sort of in my mind represents sort of the whiteness, and there's a feminine energy that we haven't really been able to fully engage in. And I think in my life right now, I'm like trying to like access femininity and like feminine energy. But I think in the long run, that there's sort of a higher plane that moves past Black and white or feminine and masculine. And I think like for me, like true authenticity lives where those things are fused together and there's no discernment between the two, and you're able to like fully engage in all of it. And for me, what's been really difficult is I have found myself so angry and dealing with like, okay, how has suffering influenced like my psyche and like, and influenced sort of my reaction to say like that Trump or whatever, or something like that, you know, like my human and my, what am I trying to say? So in my like earthly sort of body, there's like an angry feeling around like anyone that would harm anything else. But I think that in my spiritual plane or in my higher self, if you peel back again, like all of these things, true authenticity and peace, like those types of, that wouldn't bother you, if that makes sense.
Yep,
I'm trying to break through into this next level, and it's, I'm just working through it. I know that's, you know, again, kind of fluffy.
From my standpoint, it's actually that fluffiness that brings our authenticity to the forward. That's actually why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's when we recognize the connection between our spiritual self and our who we are in our work. That's where I feel that synergy happens between that duality that you're describing. And when we're in synergy with it, that's when the greatest action occurs. That's when we're at our best. That's when we're able to really be out there. And, you know, we can still do the work. This is something that I've been thinking about. We can still do the work, you know, in a material plane, meaning like we can still do the work to change laws, to change policies, to, you know, all these, the day-to-day, my veterinary work.
Right.
And we can still be aware that there is a broader universal, something deeper that connects all of us, right? And so, yeah, and so I understand that reluctance to say yes, that's the fluffy answer to it, but it also speaks to, you know, that shift, that growth that happens in people, which I think leads to more impactful work.
Right.
And it's when we deny that. I'm really interested in when you said that you're trying to harness that female energy, right? Like that female component, and that you've been reading different authors and people around that. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? You have with the background of you have somewhat of a unique upbringing, right? With your mom and with where you were raised and not having your father there. So you had very strong female presence.
Right.
And yeah, if you can speak to that a little bit.
So it's interesting. It informs, I guess, a lot of who I am. And I write about, I'm going to publish a book at some point, but I wrote about how I feel like I learned more about womanhood from a queer mother than I could ever have learned from like a heteronormative relationship. And what was really interesting, and also I like thank her 1,000 times over, is I never had this male figure in my life that said, you can't do that, or you can't dress that way, or girls don't do this, or, you know, that never even occurred to me. Like no male presence ever said, you know, put limitations on my womanhood. Now, the flip side of that is like my mother was she has sort of this, she's very anti-man, you know, kind of has like this grudge towards men or something. And I think it has pushed me to be like, to think I need to be this strong woman and I'm a feminist and like just by default. And I think that I have really grown a lot of masculine like energy and traits in myself, given the fact that I was raised by mostly women, which is sort of counterintuitive. So now that I'm an adult, I realize, wow, I grew up in a very rigid way. Like she had this expectation of like, you're a woman and you can be anything you want to be, and you need to go do this, and like you need to get straight A's and like all these things. And now I'm like actually refining sort of like to me like what womanhood is. Like, you know, it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to look any certain way. And I think that for so long I had been so hard on myself because I came from a certain place, and I thought, okay, since I'm from the bottom, I need to be on the top, like, or I need to like overachieve. Now I'm like, actually, I'm digging into like, no, like what makes me happy, and like maybe liberation for me isn't necessarily, you know, working on all these policies, but it's actually like joy, you know. And I think that's like sort of honing into that feminine energy and figuring out, for me, what is flow. You know, I feel like I've experienced flow when it comes to horses, but just like flow in general, like what is it to, for example, I try to like pinpoint places in my life or moments in my life that I was like, this is a beautiful moment. And like, how can I sort of like recreate beautiful moments that I've experienced? Yeah.
What are those practices then that you use to recreate those beautiful moments?
Well, it's stuff like, it's really the most basic of things. Like I'm talking like in the morning, drinking coffee and like actually sitting down and drinking it, and like sitting with myself and not like jumping on the phone first thing and checking emails, or it means boundaries, like saying no to like most things, you know, or you know, sitting on the porch, like listening to birds, you know, stuff that is just, it was free, like things that are not even, you know, or maybe it's stretching, you know, in the morning. And I also think that there is a level of creating my life in a way that, you know, I'm not working to just work, you know, I'm working because there's a purpose behind the work. And I know you're not always going to love every moment of everything, but being able to sort of grow more patience in what I'm doing, that's been the hardest thing, I think, is growing patience. But it's actually coming as I get older.
You have been listening to my interview with Gabrielle Chapman. This is Jyothi Robertson for The Journey You Own.